Hi, this is Janet Fitch, and it is noon on Wednesday. So it must be Writing Wednesday, where I answer your writing questions, craft questions, psychological questions, philosophical questions, existential questions, questions about the writing business and making a living, and all things writing, because the writer is dealing with all these issues. There is no separation, although that's actually what we're going to be talking about a little bit today. The question for the day is dealing with the separation of the writing self and the self that goes to the store and that uh, people in the neighborhood know you, and how that divides and why they're different, and how to handle that. Some people are very uncomfortable with that, noticing that. So I think we will just dive in, and please, if you have questions during the Writing Wednesday, go ahead and put them in the chat, and we can talk about them. And if you have questions for me in between times, you can grab me through my website, janetfitchwrites.com. So here's our first question, is from Sarah. So Sarah, if you're here yet, uh, this is your question. Um, so Sarah asks, not sure if you've touched on this in Writing Wednesdays before. Oh, this is yesterday. This is last week's question. I've been having some problems with my printer, so it's finding the question that was asked of me, and I'm going to have to paraphrase it because I thought I printed it out and it did not print. So there we go. The question had been, hi Jill, hi Amy. This was a question that was asked um, of me. It's like people, this woman, people were doing it from memory. People were always surprised to meet her, and they say, and read her, and like colleagues at work and stuff were commenting on how different her writing was from who she was, and she was feeling very strange about that. um, and I thought that was a really good question to address, because it borders on a lot of other issues, psychological issues, and also our awareness of our own writing. Hi, Jill. Hi, Amy. Hi, Gail. Hi, Danny. Good to see you. Um, the divide between the self and the writer self and the everyday self is what I think of it. And people, this woman found it very upsetting that her colleagues and stuff say, there's a disconnect between the person we know and the person that we just read your work. And it's true, your readers will know you differently than the people in your everyday life. In everyday life, you try, many of us try to be, especially the more socialized you are, the more there is a divergence between the everyday self and the writer self. Um, you know, uh, I remember having this, especially when I was still had school age kid, that people would read my stuff and go, I can't, you're so different than you are on the page. And because in life, so much of life is about getting along with people, of not getting into it with people, um, learning not to wear your heart on your sleeve, learning not to engage with everything that happens around you. I can say that for me, the divergence began in earnest when I was a newspaper editor in a small town. And I had to be able to get along with all kinds of people. For the first time in my life, I was dealing with people very, very different from me. This was a ranching town, and it had a huge spread of kinds of people. Uh, everything from the hippies in the hills to the working ranchers to the people who, lived in a small town in a very gossipy kind of situation. People who lived out on the land and didn't want to have interaction with anybody. Um, Very religious people from, several different faiths, types of Christian faith. um, very different economic outlook, very, just the most diverse community when you really think of it. And I, as the newspaper lady, I had to deal with all of these people on good terms. Not always, but I did my best. And it was the first time in my life that I stopped sharing my personal opinions about everything that crossed my path. I mean, I was a very, very um, opinionated, outspoken, having to, have my say about every darn thing. And it was a growing up process to learn to kick back, let people be who they are, deal with them and, the commonalities, the things we're trying to achieve together, um, cover their news. This was their town, not my town. I mean, I lived there, but there were people who lived there for generations, I'm the new person. I mean, evidently, actually, they used to hire people for this little newspaper for editors who came from out of town because they just didn't know all of the tripwires. Other people who lived there were, they didn't want anything to do with running that paper because they knew everything and they knew how fraught everything was going to be, whereas I had no idea. But I learned not to put my heart on my sleeve anymore, because I needed to get along with everybody. And the more it's part of a growing up process too, learning to socialize, learning to make nice, Um, and then when I had school age child, you are interacting with parents, you're interacting with families of the kids that your kid is going to be friends with. And, you don't necessarily express everything that crosses your brain pan. So readers, when you sit down to the page, you are writing what you really think. And sometimes you don't even know what you think until you are writing those scenes. And it's like, wow, that's what I really think. When I don't even know what I think until I'm writing. I think that's something fairly common with writers. We That's why we write. We don't know what we think until we're writing it, and then it's like, oh yeah, I really do believe that. In life, I am far more helpful, friendly, get along. Not always opinionated. I'm not always opining, if the occasion doesn't call for it and nobody asked for it, and trying to get along with people and trying to encourage people and trying to, look on the bright side of blah, blah, blah. If you read my work, you see what I'm like on the inside. I'm on the dark side. I'm dramatic. I'm highly opinionated. I care a lot about certain things and have done a lot of f- thinking through moral issues and the philosophy and spirituality and things that I don't generally bring to a social encounter. So your readers know you differently. And in some ways, your readers know you better than the people you see every day because they know the interior self. Hi, Brenda. Hi, Blair. Um, so that don't be surprised when people read your work and go, "Oh my God, I, I don't even recognize this person." It's like, that's right, because this is what is really going on as we're at the PTA meeting, or this is the person really sitting next to you at that dinner party. You're not necessarily going to be exposing that. And also, when you're writing, you are really thinking more deeply about things. It's not, I'm presented with a situation and boom, I've got an opinion. I know what everybody should do, blah, 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 blah. In writing, you're presented with a situation and you start pulling it apart. One of the difficulties with novelists, when people want you to be on their side and reduce your thoughts to headlines in a in a social media post. It's very difficult for writers often to do that, because life is more subtle than that, and we want to turn things around and really think about it, and acknowledge our paradoxes, that we do believe this and also this. And in writing is where we get to handle that material and put the different sides of ourselves into play against one another and really see what we think. You know, if it's um, for instance, things that most editors, people who make movies and stuff, they don't want to oh, let's just take this part out and simplify, blah, blah, blah. But as writers, it's like, no, the process of working out what really is true, you've got to press on the different parts of yourself and then see them interact. And then you can see what you really think. Does that person die or not? Um, I remember trying to decide whether, in one book, I have a murder, and in White Oleander, and trying to decide whether the character goes to prison. Um, and I decided yes, that you you do the deed, and you do. People do go to prison. People, bad things do happen to people. I do believe it. I am not walking through a field of daisies. Even if I try to look on the bright side in my real life, I don't have to do that. In my fiction, I have to say what it is I really think and really see. Um, and I do think, like almost all of my books and most of my writing, people do triumph over their situation. They do triumph over adversity, but they have to fight for it. Nobody gets it handed to them. I recoil when I read things that, you know, somebody doesn't just, like, I remember reading Ian McEwan's Saturday, and, the guy is in the alley and the thugs are beset this doctor and his son, and the doctor talks his way out of a good thrashing. And I'm like, no, that's not the world that I know. The world that I know, that doctor's going to get kicked to shit. And the fact that he's brilliant and a doctor will make no difference to those thugs. Not like, oh, but I treated your mother back at, it's like bullshit. I have a very strong bullshit detector. And in real life, I keep it on the down low. If somebody's feeding me a bunch of crap, I'm like, oh, I'm not the one who's likely to get in their face and go, that's just crap. I'm just gonna sit there and go, yeah, yeah, you know, well, I know you. I know this is just a load of crap, and I'm not taking anything in that you're saying. Um, But there is a shock, and when you're younger, you want to be the author that reflects your work. So a lot of young authors, and there's nothing wrong with this. There's nothing wrong with this, but it's almost like cosplay. you know. I want to be thought of as a romantic. I want to be thought of as a, avant-garde, so I do a persona. I become that character who would be a character in my own book. I'm going to replicate that in physical reality. Um, and I don't think there's anything wrong with it. If you go to a big author event, we're having the Festival of Books at the end of April, and you will see writers who believe that they should personify their work, so that there is absolute congruence between the work and the author. Um, I can think of several people that I'm not going to name who do that. They want to be in their own books. Um, Laura said, "Hi, Laura." Laura says it's kind of what scares me about writing. I feel so vulnerable. Yeah, isn't that interesting? Um, I I think that's why this woman uh, um, had the problem. It's the people like me who are the go along to get along kind of people in life who shock the people on the page more. Um, there's a line from a Dylan song, I might look like Robert Frost, but I feel just like Jesse James, you know? That's more my that's more my thing. I remember uh, going to New York when White Oleander sold my first novel, um, about a foster kid, and I went into the publisher and they started talking to me who I am and blah blah blah. The marketing people are there, publicity people are there, the publisher is there, editors, and and afterwards I felt like I'd really disappointed them because I'm not a foster kid. I had 2 parents, who were both quite present, and, I had not I'd lived in the same house my whole not my whole life, but most of my life, and my mother was still living there 60 years. So the instability of Astrid's life was certainly nothing I had ever experienced. Um, that was more of a kind of a channeling. Um, but I felt that I'd really disappointed the publisher, and I get back, from it, and I'm talking to my agent, um, and he said, "Well, what happened?" He wasn't there, and so I was telling how they were quizzing me and how disappointing I felt that I was because I'm a very normal person, somebody's mom, somebody in the market. Um, and my agent said, "No, they're not disappointed." The questions they were asking were really, "Are you the character in the book?" With the idea that if you are the character in the book, then you've just told your story. So what else are you going to write? Whereas if it was pure fiction, well, nothing's pure fiction. But if it's this was a fictional work, um, then there are other books that a person with that kind of imagination can produce. And actually, it was better that I wasn't Astrid, that it was, I'm not relying on the fact that it's a personal story. There were elements that were personal, for sure. But the discordance comes, I think, from a naivete of people, especially, people who aren't used to reading a lot of fiction. The idea, the expansiveness of the imagination, and the quality of imagination isn't something that you display in your everyday life. And I don't believe that you should feel bad if look like Robert Frost but feel like Jesse James. I think that's going to be the case for many, many people. So this is my lint. I don't know your name. Um, when you're deciding the fate of a character, say a death or prison, do you write it out or do you work it out in your head? Have you ever wrote something that scared you afterwards? Oh, Marie. Okay, this is my lens. Marie, hi. Um, I I do worry it out. I do not ever write things in my head. I I believe that the muse favors the working writer, and I never get ideas that um, except when I'm writing. Um, so I do write it out, and I mean I might get an idea, but I don't work it out in my head. I work it out on the page. Um, have you ever written something that scared you afterwards? Yeah, I can get very superstitious, and that's something that people in my uh, I don't know if people generally in my real life know that about me is that I can be very superstitious. I can be super paranoid. Um, and when I write something really bad that seems kind of close to things that are going on in my life, I worry superstitiously that, I am invoking something. Um, yeah, so it definitely scares me sometimes, the things I write. But I have to write what, uh, either you give yourself permission to write what you write and think what you think on the page, even if you're revealing parts of yourself that people don't see. If I'm really kind of a, I could, at times in my life, I have been very kind of a bit of a revenge kind of a person, nursing wounds and thinking very ill of certain people. And figure, it's like revenge is a dish best served cold. It's like, and it's something that I did not like about myself. It was something that I had my therapy. I feel like I've done a lot of work with Qigong, which is about storing energy in other people by doing good things for people, and I have a great belief in that. I have a great belief in contributing positively to the world. So I really had to confront my vengeance side. But in fiction, I can give that to a character and they can kill their boyfriend or whatever, have their revenge. I mean, Ingrid in White Oleander is nothing but that. um, so what's nice about writing, and I'm not a big writing as therapy person. That's not. I'm trying to create art. I'm not interested in I just go to the therapist to deal with the outer world, but the inner world you have to have freedom to write what you're going to write, what really feels true to you, and it's safer than walking around like that. um, I'm not very confrontational in real life. I've come to value um, community and not having to be right all the time and just letting people unwind their thing as they go. And if somebody does something that it feels like an affront to me, I don't feel like I have to pay them back. I feel like, yeah, yeah, okay, they're kind of a cruddy person and they're stuck being a cruddy person, and that's their being them is their own is my revenge, is that they are who they are and they have to live with that. um, but I can do it in my work, and then people are surprised. Oh my god, um, you're a lot darker than I thought. Well, yes and no. Yes and no. My work is. um, What if you write, Laura says, what if you write like Jesse James would feel like Robert Frost? Is it okay to be really disingenuous? It's not disingenuous. It's what part, I don't feel that it is disingenuous. I feel that it is, there's some things that are in your secret life. The writing is your secret life, and you have absolute freedom to be and do whatever you want in that secret life. And then you have other concerns as a functioning human being, you know. Maybe you are Jesse James in your inner life, but in your outer life, you also value order. You also value harmony. You also value, um, having a quiet life for your family. You also want to be supportive of friends. You're not, to say that you feel like Jesse James inside, even though people think you're Robert Frost, you're both. But the Jesse James part is maybe a side of yourself that you're not going to express in outer life, because it is harmful to your mental health and the mental health of people around you. And maybe you don't, I mean, the shrinks would say act out. You don't necessarily have to share that with the world. If you want to build if you want to build a community around yourself, if you want to help people, if you want to be seen as somebody people can turn to in a tough time, you don't exhibit all of your own craziness. Why would you? So Steve DeGroot, hi Steve, I've gotten over offending people in my work. It took a while, but I jettisoned the fear. Yeah. So the work can offend anybody and everybody. And I'm sure it always does. Someone is going to be offended. It's like not everybody likes chocolate, you know? So if you're going to be chocolate on the page and a really rich, slightly bitter, chocolate, there are going to be people who are not going to like it. If you find nobody dislikes what you do, nobody is also going to be crazy about it. It's going to stimulate no strong reaction. So if you know, are afraid to evoke a strong reaction in your books, then it's not going to affect people. It's muted, and it's okay to be muted in real life. You know, not everybody wants to be the drama queen. I'm here. Um, I don't want to be that, but you want to make an impact on the page. You know, there is a movie I've told you about, the Eye Has to Travel, the Deanna Vreeland movie. It's a fabulous movie, but she's a character. See the difference between being a character, like we all know people. She's such a character. you know, do you want to be a character like that? Some people do. They like to be the character. They want to walk into a room and everybody knows that's so and so. Oh, what a character. Um, but I find, um, for myself, I prefer a warmer, um, less assaultive kind of behavior. But I have characters in my books that are extremely invasive, strong, opinionated, difficult, kind of people, and they're great. They're great characters. But I don't worry about offending people as much as I worry about telling truth, my own truth, the world as I see it, because often the way I can get that down, people will go, my God, I've never seen that on the page. I've never heard anybody say it. I think that all the time, and I've never seen anybody say it. Whereas you have some people who would just prefer you not say it. And, it's my book. That's my playpen. That's my confession, my confessor's booth. Um, so you're going to see a different self, you know, on the page than you see in real life. People were very surprised that I had wrote political books, you know, the Revolution of Marina M and Chimes of Lost Cathedral, you know, about history and politics and, you know, how the divide between what people say they're doing and what they're actually doing. You know, I think it's super you know, it applies to our current world. Um, you're more complex on the page. You know, people don't see the complexity as much in your real life. The real life, you are actually more complex because you're looking at you have different concerns on the page than you do in life. Um, and if you want to have a successful life, to your own definition of success, uh, and you want to be a good writer, your concerns in those two arenas are very different. And if you know, we're coming up on the book festival, in which case many of you are going to meet writers who are your heroes, and some of them are not very nice people. I gotta say that whenever you have a chance to meet one of your heroes, think carefully about it because often the they save the best of themselves for the page. They're thoughtful, they're kind, they're generous, um, they bring the best of humanity, their humanity, limited though it might be, to the page. And then you meet them and they're egotistical jerks. And that's the truth. And it's a shock and it's unpleasant to find that out about your heroes. Um, boy, she understands me. Her books, you know, she understands me. And then you meet her and she's like, you know, next. Yeah, so writers are different in their secret life. Often they're better, and often they're not better. Often they're darker, or and both. Um, so Gail is liking my Russian novels. Thank you. Um, and let's see. So Sarah says, as a reserved introvert, I relish being able to save the 80% of myself I don't express in person for the page. Yeah, yeah. You know, a lot of us are very nice in real life and we get along and we go to the committee meetings, we go to the PTA meetings, and oh, so nice to see you. And we are happy to see you, you know, and we do it, but, you know, we don't have to take over the meeting and you know my issue is the issue and everybody else is going, can we get out of here now, you know, but you have to listen to me and my problems. And they're often they are like that on the page, you know, they just feel they need to be that person all the time. And hi Wendy. And that is, it's a way of living. It, um, when I was younger I was very much of a piece. My inner and outer really matched. You know, I was dark, I was difficult, I was dramatic, I was romantic. I was living like I wanted to live like a character in a novel. I wanted to be that. Um, and then something started happening. I was living a pretty wild life, and I noticed that I wasn't writing as much because I was so busy being a character that I wasn't able to quiet down enough to get to the page. And I had to grow up a little bit to develop an outer life that was quiet enough that I could be that um, intense on the page. when I was living a very intense life, I could not write that way. So that's interesting too. Um, then we have a second, and also I do not write about my family and never did. I do not write about my marriages. I don't write about my daughter, but things I've learned or things that I have thought about that they have stimulated go onto the page. I think being a memoirist, uh, writing memoir, writing nonfiction, um, is more emotionally challenging to the writer because you are writing about yourself. I don't write about myself. I try not to. I mean, I might talk about my, these weird processes, but to write a memoir and tell you why I am the way I am is like, I don't think so. Okay. But yeah, the secret, Amy says, our secret self surface on the page. And that is one of the best things about being a writer, is you have a place for that. All the things that you learn in therapy not to do because your characters have not had therapy. And this is who you would be if you were all this side of yourself. What if I was all my insecurity? Who would that be? I give it all to character, who is all of her insecure. All of my insecurities are into this character. All of my vengefulness and egotism is this character, and all of my, you know, uh, being stuck in the past. I can give that to that character, and then I can let them fight it out because that's what they're doing in the psyche, right? It's very, very freeing and very validating, and it's not therapy. It isn't therapy. It is something else. It's expression. We therapize our regular lives, but expression and honesty and exploration is what's going on the page. Okay, well, we have another question by Brenda. So Brenda, you're here, and I have your question from last night. So good. Thank you for sending. Please send me your questions. It's much more fun when I have your questions, when you've sent them to me through my email, or you've put them in the chat here. So Brenda has an interesting question. I'm interviewing an author at a local bookstore tonight. Yeah. And curious what the best and worst questions you've ever been asked at an event like that. What question do you hope an interviewer might ask? I did a tremendous amount of touring and interviewing when White Oleander came out. And the questions were different in America than they were internationally. The questions in America tended to be the same questions over and over and over again. Were you a foster kid? You know, um, what do you think of this? What do you think of, where did that book come from? Um, is a question every single person asks. Especially when you go to a TV station and they haven't read the book, and they'll always ask you where did it come from. It's just like, well, yeah, where does a river come from? Many different tributaries lead to the river of that ends up being the book. Many things come into it, and they come in even as you're writing it. It's like, oh yeah, all these different concerns come together into a book. I think that the worst question is, were you in foster care? The identification of the writer with the work. I think those are terrible questions. The terrible questions are the ones where the lazy ones, ones where and I used to get this a lot, is where the person asks a short question which requires pages and pages and pages of answer. And it's a lack of research that they didn't see what was already said. So they just ask something that would take you so long to really dig in and give them an honest answer. Writers love a question that's never been asked before. When I was in touring White Oleander, um, I did a series of interviews, and it was Italy, and it was like one journalist after another, after another, after another, like 15 in a row. And the questions were really different. I had never, somebody asked, was Marilyn Monroe's story, the blonde girl in Hollywood, goes into foster care, and blah, blah. Did the Marilyn Monroe story affect you at all? And it was just like, it had never occurred to me that I had been affected by Marilyn's story, but of course I had. I knew that story very well, and of course it had. It's part of the story of Hollywood. It's part of the story of my city. So of course it had affected me. Um, I think the best questions often are thematic. If you can identify the themes of the book, rather than asking, how did this happen? How did you think of this? You might think, did this come from a short story? Did you start with, um, you know, did you write it in chronological order, or did you move around? You can ask about, I think that if the book is a departure from the last thing the person wrote, and hopefully it is, you say, you can certainly talk about how does that fit together, the person who wrote that first book and the person who wrote this book. You know, do the works speak to each other, or they show a different side of the person's thought process or worldview? Has your worldview changed in the last 10 years or 5 years is a really good question. Um, think of, like, what would be asked on a show where a TV show where the interviewers are very well practiced, but have not necessarily read the book. And then what, as somebody who's read the book, what can you ask? Um, Definitely looking at interviews and stuff of that person, um, and avoiding the most common questions. Um, the worst questions are trying to link the person's personal life to the book. It's not a very intellectual way to go about uh, asking about a text. I know that if they want to talk about it, believe me, they will move towards what they want to talk about. I think that like, think about when I was in a college. There was a form of literary criticism. It was called the New Criticism, and the New Criticism was you only read the book. You didn't know anything about the author, and then you just discussed what the text was in front of you. And so we'd read like Sophocles or Herodotus or Thomas Mann or somebody, and you were not supposed to read secondary materials. You were supposed to roll up your sleeves and look at that text. Um, so, yeah, I think that, that, let's see, and I always write down the best questions once they've done it. Um, you could say, is, um, is your style how has your style evolved? The writing, the actual writing, but you also have to think of always what the audience of your event wants to know. Uh, and mm, you're always moving between them. I mean, I got a lot of help with, that when I was writing for a small town newspaper. I had to get a really good idea of who my audience was and what do they wanna know, um, and then what is it that you want to explore? Because maybe your audience doesn't really know how to think about a book, They always wanna know, is it real? So you could even discuss the trend of, like, based on a true story, why are Americans so literal minded? Why are they having such a struggle understanding, the difference between, understanding the value of fiction, of things, that truths can be expressed in in an imaginary world in a way that you can't really, explore as interestingly in a direct way. That there are things you can get to in fiction, um, that this addiction to true story, that fiction can be truer than life, as we were just talking about the persona of the writer, um, in real life and th the self that's expressed on the page. Um, uh-huh, so it's a local, it's fascinating, okay. International questions were so varied and more interesting than in the US, yeah, because journalists in foreign countries are trained as journalists, whereas journalists in America are often they take these classes in communication, so they're really spokesmodels. They're more personalities than they are journalists. So the questions are pretty lazy. Um, they they just they check off the box rather than trying to think of something interesting that will interest the writer, but also meet the needs of the audience. So it's a very local audience, and the book is set in Myanmar. So some of it is going to be questions, that will elicit responses that will help the audience understand some of the issues, some of the history. I think a lot of people, might not know what is what Myanmar is about, what's going on there, why did it, you know, um, if this is a personal story, if this is a political story, if it avoided the political story, if there is subtext about the politics of it's a very closed dictatorship, and it's a theocracy, and a uh, it's a country in which one, I don't think it's a minority, but it's a one cultural group, has demanding the other cultural groups conform to its, um, hegemony, and is enforcing it in a very brutal way. Um, so it's asking questions that will help the reader, the audience, understand kind of the arena of the book. Um, and so I think that your questions are going to evolve around that, and then how do you bring it home? How do you it's fiction, it's like you have an issue, like I'm writing about the Russian Revolution. Do I want to write a book about Lenin and Trotsky and stuff? No. I want to write about how it is to live in that world. How is it to be at, you know, under the effect of their rulings, and what's it like on the ground to be a human being in this society. So I don't know if that's how it works. The politics and military, Brenda says, are all background, but the characters maneuver within it. Yeah, so that's a really good topic to talk about. And um, it's and then how the characters and their problems reflect. Do they echo? Are there parts of the book in which what's happening to the characters echoes these policies? I know in Marina M, which is uh, part of it's the Russian Revolution. So it's Lenin and Trotsky, and it's the Bolsheviks, who are very ideological. We're seeing what that's like. Very ideological, um, but they're also about changing the perception of what you're seeing isn't what you're seeing. What you're seeing, who do you believe, me or your own lying eyes? Um, that you have to see everything through the lens that we're giving you, this ideological lens. And that I had a cult in the Marina M, and people were like, why is this cult there in the country? Why do you go from the revolution, the politics and the streets of Petrograd to some snowy enclave with this cult? It's because there is a direct echo between a cult, that cult especially, and what was going on in the larger society. It was a cult, the Bolsheviks, that's you could say, a successful cult. And so the cult was a microcosm of what was going on. And there was this very strong link. So if you can see thematic links of macro to micro, that's an interesting question. Yeah. So if it's nonfiction, you might want to talk about a connection between what's going on in this country and what's going on in Myanmar. If it's fiction, the writer will not appreciate that. That would be the kind of thing that you would allow them to bring up, if that's what's happening, because they want to talk about their book. So it's all about the book. So you can talk about how it's organized, how does the chaptering work? I mean, things that keeping the reader and the audience in mind. You never want to lose the audience, uh, to see how that unfolds. I think I know the book that you're going to be talking about, but we'll see. So the worst questions I'm asked are always the same questions. Where does this come from? Where did you get the idea? As if an idea, comes out of your head. I don't get ideas. But it's like, what was the spark of this? That's, the spark of the actual writing of this book, um, is a good question. What are you looking for in a novel? Is a really good question of a novelist. What do you look for in a novel? And then you can relate that back to the book that they wrote. Um, are there any books in that field that you strongly disagree with, or that you strongly were attracted to, before writing this book? Let's see, what else were good questions? The bad questions are just the questions that think of the question that a junior high kid would ask, and then don't ask that question. The question of where did it come from? Was your mother terrible? Um, and try to work with the text. Try to work with what you're seeing on the page. The Golden Land by Liz Schick. Interesting. I was thinking of Miss Burma by Charmaine Craig, also about Myanmar, historical. Yeah, the gold, interesting. Talk about gold. The importance of gold in Burma, in Myanmar. It's very interesting. Their aesthetic is good. Um, why the title is really interesting. Titles are hard. So I bet she'll have some good thoughts about that. So Sarah asks, do you find that audience questions during public events tend to be more varied or a lot of the same? Well, after a public event, when the serious questions have started to be asked in the event, the questions from the audience are usually much better. They won't say where did it come from, because they'll already know. They'll be so far ahead of that. The trick of, and this is more really for the writer than the interviewer, but for both of you, the questions from the audience are often not, you have to think about what they're really asking, and don't answer the superficial question. Do you write on a typewriter or on a computer? It's they're trying to picture your process. So if you can widen out that question to, instead of computer versus typewriter or longhand, to think, what is your process? That's an interesting question. So think about the question behind the question, because often people can be a little inarticulate. So you have to think about what do they really want to know here. So the book won the AWP prize for the novel. Very cool. Very cool. So anyway, I hope that you know not to, don't bend yourself backwards trying to be a character that would match your work, but just know that there is going to be some divergence between you as an everyday human being and your secret life on the page, and it's not a shameful or hypocritical thing. It's a testimony to the complexity of the human being and the creative process, and the privacy of the creative process, and the special relationship between the reader and the writer. It's a very special relationship. Um, so thank you very much for joining me, and we'll see you next week for Writing Wednesday. Thank you.